Hello, art historians, and welcome to our second lecture over Impressionism, where in this lecture we're going to start looking at the artists and the artwork that is featured on the 250 for the AP Art History exam that they created, that the College Board wants you to know. So we're going to start with Edouard Manet, and Manet is very easily confused with Monet because they do sound so similar, but be aware that they are two very different artists. And Manet is your typical bridge artist, and that is something I really want you guys to know about them. So when we looked at Marie Vigie Lebrun in France, she is kind of that bridge between Rococo and neoclassical. Like the way she painted was Rococo, but her ideas are neoclassical. And we also talked about Ingres and the Grande Odalisque, which was kind of this transition between neoclassical and romanticist. And Manet is going to be that transition between realism and impressionism. The way that he paints is impressionistic. So he paints in that very fleeting style with just focusing on the color, big flat blocks of color that we see very common in Japanese art. And his work is what we call very painterly. And what I mean by painterly is kind of when we look at Monet also, that their work shows, you can definitely tell it's painted. Like you can see the brush strokes, you can see the lines that the brush made. And he does that on purpose because he's deliberately showing you that he's painting in a different way. However, while most of the Impressionists don't really have an agenda, they're not really trying to show anything, they're not really worried about content, Manet is still worried about content. Like he is really focused on taking content from the past that is considered classical and putting it in a modern setting. And that probably wouldn't have been such a big deal, but the way that he does it made it even more offensive for people, which I will explain. So I call him a classical corrupter because what he would do is he would take very famous works of art from the past that great artists like Raphael or Michelangelo or Titian had done and put them in a modern setting, which makes him very much a modernist and makes him a realist. But the way that he physically paints is definitely impressionistic. He uses big pieces of color, big chunks of color, definitely is not trying to hide that it's painted. So he really is a good example of that bridge. So, for example, this is one work of art that just really riled people up that Manet did. So what he's got here, it's called Luncheon on the Grass, and it's in the middle of a park. There's a dress of the woman down here that she is obviously taken off with her hat. There's another woman bathing in the background, and you have two guys sitting here with a naked woman who is engaging you, and it's clearly in the middle of the day. So and this would be recognizable as a French park at the time. So where this riled people up is this particular painting is actually a modern spin on a work that had been done in Venice and also one by Raphael. So for example, if you look here, this is called the Pastoral Concert up here on the left, and the bottom one is actually done by Raphael, and it's a very famous scene. So he basically composed two Renaissance masters, put their paintings together, put it in a modern scene, changed the way that he painted it. Like he wasn't trying for naturalism, he was trying to accentuate certain things with those big blocks of color, and it highly offended people. They're like, you're messing up this famous work of art by, she is very stark white, like very thick white paint. You can see that her dress is on the ground, which means at one point she had it on the ground. And it was just very crude, not only in what he did with the scene. And he's like, well, what's the big deal? Like, you did it in the past. This is just in the now that's right in front of us. And people were like, the way you painted it is really offensive. So the work of art for the 250 that you need to know is this one. And this one is called Olympia. All right. And you'll notice here that he has basically taken the Venus of Urbino, and instead of painting a woman as an object, he was really just kind of painting a nude woman. That's what Titian was painting. Manet's more of a realist. He's painting a scene as it would be. The content is more important here in terms of what he's doing. So this is where he's not quite the Impressionist, because he's got an agenda in what he's showing. And this was based on poems that were being written at the time about French life. which means that everybody knows this is going on. And this is a prostitute. And here she is laying on a bed, and it's styled after Titian. But look how he has altered it. She's being brought flowers instead of a dress. So she's clearly not being troubled to put a dress on. This woman is in her space, so she's not isolated. She's not alone. It still draws the attention right to where it's, the focus is in terms of her sexuality. She's engaging you right in the face, and her head is not like down or kind of tilted. She's looking right at you. And just to even more accentuate the fact that she's got on she's got on heels, and she's got on a bracelet and a choker around her neck. And instead of a little puppy dog, which represents loyalty, he's painted in over here on the right a black cat, which is about kind of like witchiness and sexuality and being very erotic. So he basically took Titian's work, put it in a modern setting, which offended people already. They're like, you're corrupting Titian's work. He was painting a naked woman. You're commenting on prostitution at the time. Like, yours has more of agenda instead of painting a nude woman. And it also was very offensive because he paints with such big blocks of color, the white, her pale skin, those big blocks of brown, and which is, by the way, Japanese style wallpaper. And then over here on the right, these big blocks of green. It just accentuates her nudity even more. It's this flat color, which is kind of just harsh, rather than being fleshy and soft like Titian did. So it wasn't just what he was painting that was a problem, because, he was like, what? Titian painted it. I'm just updating it. I'm painting it as now to comment on the fact that we have prostitution in Paris and everybody knows it. So why are we hiding it? And then at the same time, they're like, but it's the way you painted it. There's nothing soft about her. It's not fleshy. It's not feminine. It's just harsh and blocky. Like, just, you drew her body and then colored her in, and it just shows that she's nude even more. And it's just such a harsh scene that people really didn't like. So this is called Olympia, and Manet gets the credit for painting. If Titian was the father of the nude, then Olympia makes Manet the father of the modern nude, because he's painting a nude of that time in a new way. It wasn't fleshy, it wasn't soft, it wasn't a Venus. And just to be clear about that, he named it Olympia, which at the time was kind of like a name taken by women of the evening. So he's like, I don't understand what the problem is. I'm painting something from the past that Titian has done. But he's also showing, like, was it appropriate then? Is it appropriate now in terms of the different setting? This is no Venus. This is a real woman, a real prostitute in a real brothel. And eventually, actually, the Royal Academy accepted this painting to be shown. But really, I think they did it because it would get viewers to come in and see it for sure. So Manet is not to be confused with Monet. Monet is very, very different, because unlike Manet, who's a bridge artist, Monet is not a bridge. He is a true impressionist. Remember, the term impressionism comes from his work of art, Impression Sunrise. Monet is not painting a scene. He's not painting an agenda. He's not commenting on social life at the time, which Manet does. He instead is painting the light. And where there's shadow, where there's light, where there's colors, all he is doing is putting color where he saw it on the canvas, and then that would be used by the eye to blend together to create this. So unlike people like Manet, who would still use much longer colors to paint, this guy is going to use much smaller colors. So where before we've seen painters, you can just kind of picture Titian when he's painting the Venus of Urbino, like he's got those long strokes kind of going down her leg, and you kind of got these strokes of paint getting the red in the curtains. Monet, on the other hand, would use almost like little commas of color, because if he saw in front of him only one spot of color, that's what he was going to paint, like just in that section, to where it would all blend together and create this image. So I love this quote by Monet because I really feel like it summarizes what real Impressionists were about. And it's when you go out to paint, try to forget what objects you have before you. Merely think, here is a little square of blue, here an oblong of pink. And those together would create an image. And one of the places he really liked to do this was in his water garden, or his French garden and his Japanese garden. And you can see here how he can capture the light on the water and in the trees, and the light coming through the trees and reflecting onto the bridge. Like, very much, he wouldn't tell you he's painting the bridge. He'd say, I'm painting the light and the colors create the bridge. So Monet, again, like I said, would go outside to paint because that's what Impressionists did. If you're going to capture light, you want to catch it from the source. And he would paint dozens of canvases over and over and over again of the exact same image just to see the image change. All right. And he was just very good at showing how it would be, he would put all these together so that you could see the progression of the light and the way that that changed the image. Because remember, these guys aren't about the content. It's art because of how they paint it. So for example, here he is painting haystacks, the exact same haystacks from the exact same position at different times of day. And, so you can see morning, you can see dusk, you can see, kind of like middle of the day, just painting the light at different times of day. He also did this with Rouen Cathedral and poplar trees, which they said about him in one of his poplars, the effect lasted only 7 minutes, or until the sunlight left a leaf when he took out the next canvas and worked on that. Like, he's just constantly changing as the light changes. So the work that they have chosen for the 250 is this one, which is the Gare Saint-Lazare station. All right. So Monet loved to go sit in railroad stations. In fact, he picked this one. Like, he was so excited to paint this one. And he kind of saw in it this beauty of the industrial age, because the point of the ceilings of these railway stations kind of came to a point like a church, like almost like to him, this was a place of worship because it's just such, an amazing place to do art. And that you have this heavy locomotive down at the bottom, but it's lightened by the light colors that he uses. And he loves these train stations because they would let in sunlight, and then the light would reflect off the steam, and then the buildings behind it would be shady or not shady depending on how the steam was going. So this was a beautiful area in remodeled Paris for him to go and take these, this examination of light and color. So Monet and a lot of the Impressionists were kind of over the negativity of a lot of these other places, these other movements, like Romanticism and Realism were just kind of heavy. So Monet liked to, just kind of celebrate modern life. They didn't view it as a negative thing. Progress was positive. Anything moving forward, because France has been through 2 revolutions, is great. And trains to him were all about moving forward and advancing, and, not necessarily this ugly thing of, industry approaching, but just, this is the modern world that they're living in. And he wanted to capture that just in a modern way by using the Impressionist painting style. And Paris was booming. Like, there was all this building and people coming and going and, renovations, and finally this breath after, progress after the French Revolution. So I just like this, that Monet said to the owner, he said, I've decided to paint your station. For some time, I have hesitated between your station and the Gare Nouard, but I think yours has more character. So he just liked it. He's not like, oh, it symbolizes something more. He's like, no, I just like it. I want to paint it. So a couple of other Impressionist artists that are very famous, that you can see their style, is, for example, this is Renoir. All right, Renoir is not included on the 250. Renoir liked to capture the middle class. He was just a happy dude. Like, he just liked to capture this new, relaxed, industrial middle class, just to capture it, to paint it. And you can see he's got that Japanese influence because it's at a weird angle, not really worried about linear perspective, very candid at people coming in and out of the scene. the Moulin des Galettes, very, very, very impressionist and Japanese influence with the dark blocks of color. So you've got like this woman in the patterned dress and then the woman in the dark, blocky dress behind her. And then the electric lights and the light coming through the trees and like leaving shadows and reflections on the ground. Like he just liked to paint these things. It's not like I'm painting an agenda. He's not. There's also Edgar Degas, and Degas is kind of like the reluctant impressionist because while most of the impressionists like to paint outside, Degas does not. He's kind of lived a high collar life. He doesn't like to go outdoors, but his patrons, the wealthy, did like to do things outdoors. So he would go and he would do race tracks and he would do, boating events, but he really had a preference for the effect of artificial light. So not real light from outside, but the effect of, internal light, like stage lights. So he's famous for painting ballerinas. And he quoted that they call me a painter of ballet dancers without realizing that the dancers are only an excuse for me to paint beautiful materials and movement, which is what Impressionist is about. Like it's a moment, and ballerinas are constantly in motion and they wear these beautiful materials and clothes that reflect light. So Degas is known for the scenes of luxury, circuses, cafes, but above all, ballerinas, all right? And he had lived the good life. His family was very wealthy, so he had been exposed to all of these things. So he, painted inside in the things that he saw. And Degas actually hated the fact that he was the ballerina painter, but that's what he got known for. So Degas is a really good way to show that Japanese influence. So you can the composition here does not make sense at all. And it still is that idea of blocky colors with patterns. And you can see that he captures the light in their tutus. It's a very candid scene of women, kind of like Japan would paint. And ballerinas were not nude, but they wore very revealing outfits. And typically ballerinas were girls of lower class because a well-bred lady would never wear this. So men were actually allowed to go in and watch ballet rehearsals, and they might actually become a patron or sponsor of one of these girls, which is as bad as it sounds. But it's very candid. This girl's over here possibly crying in the background. Her back is to you. The composition, the floor tilts up to the back, but the grain of the floor goes a complete opposite direction. There's people in and out of the scene, like it's very crowded. On one side, it's very uneven with just the one on one side, and then it's, crowded on the other. So your eye does draw up towards her with the grain of the floor, even though the floor goes a different direction. So this is just another really good example of how Degas is so influenced by the Japanese style. The patterns with the harsh blocks of color. He's painting moments of light. He's, and movement. This is the rehearsal on stage, which is actually a pretty famous Degas, just to show the ballerinas and the artificial light of the stage lights. This is another one, Japanese style nature-based wallpaper. The composition tilts up, but the floor grain is actually going this way. I mean, just very odd compositions for Japan. So the reason that I show you Degas is because Degas is going to be a huge influence on one of the artists that we do need to know for the 250, and that's Mary Cassatt. And Mary Cassatt loved showing with the Impressionists. Her style is a little bit different, but she actually really was, she identified kind of as an Impressionist, and she hated conventional art. She began to live when she started trying this new modern way of painting. And Degas really exposed her to those Japanese styles, and especially those candid shots of women and female life. So because a lot of those Japanese prints showed women in their natural environment, to Mary Cassatt, she was an American. And she left America and became an expatriate because in America, women were not supposed to be artists. They were not supposed to be feminists. They were supposed to be submissive. She went to Europe, and there, by meeting these artists, she was able to be admired for being an artist. However, she painted what she knew. She knew the domestic sphere, most of what she would do is paintings of women in their homes or women with children. And she would combine that with that Japanese style, because that was a very common theme in Japanese art, was, you know, the secret life of women behind the scenes, like what's going on in, you know, a woman's world when no one is watching. Well, she kind of showed that, but not really in the same way that the Japanese did. I mean, sometimes she did, but hers was more about being a woman and motherhood. So this is, you can see how painterly her works are. What makes her impressionist is how she paints. You can see where all the directions of the brushstrokes are going. They're going different directions. It's big blocks of color, but it is a very candid scene. It's just one moment. And she celebrated the roles of women. Like, you want to know what's going on behind the scenes of a woman? This is what's going on. Like, we're mothers, we bathe, we take care of ourselves. And she doesn't really show men. I mean, she would on occasion, but she really rarely did, because she was celebrating women. Like, if you're going to worry about what Japanese women are doing in these paintings, let's look at what real, you know, European women that are here are doing. This one I just really like. So you can definitely see how impressionistic it is. There's not a lot of detail. There's not a lot of, you know, perspective. And here is a woman, you know, at the theater box, very, very candid moment. But if you notice, there's a man also looking over at her. So she is really the one that's on stage, which I think is kind of interesting. Very impressionistic work by Mary Cassatt here. With the, you can see where the brush strokes are. You can see the way that she did some longer strokes, some tiny brush strokes, and almost the flowers look like she just dabbed them on there. And it's just this very candid moment of a nanny taking care of two children. I just think this one's funny. This one's inspired by Degas, actually, and just a little girl and furniture that's too big. She's bored. She's just kind of candid. It's like taking, you know, little kids shopping. They're just like, are we done yet? I love these. Being a mom, like, these speak so real to me. Like, this is what being a mother is. Like, she captured, like, just like the Japanese captured what was going on in a women's world with their back turned to them, or them bathing or brushing their hair or getting dressed or whatever. She was like, yeah, but that's not reality so much as this is. This is what a woman's doing when nobody's watching. Like, the baby crawls in bed with you in the morning, or you're giving the baby a bath. But you'll notice she doesn't use linear perspective. The floor kind of tilts up like you would see in Japan. It's flat blocks of color against the pattern of her dress, the natural wallpaper in the background, and they're not really engaging with the painter. And then, of course, there's Japanese porcelain on the floor. So what I don't understand for the 250 is they didn't pick anything of Mary Cassatt that is of her and mothers and children. That's what she was known for. So this is an oddity. And I think the reason that they picked this one for the 250 is just to demonstrate just how much she was influenced by the Japanese style. All right. So, for example, you can see the Japanese natural wallpaper on the background. You can see there isn't good linear perspective. There's all different lines going different directions. You've got that harsh lines on the furniture that contrast with her in a towel. She's involved in her toilet of fixing her hair. And, you know, it's just a very candid moment. And maybe this was Mary Cassatt pandering to, you know, the demand for those Japanese works at the time, because even the woman's putting her hair up in a Japanese hairstyle, and she looks to be of Asian descent, but it's definitely got that Japanese look to it in how she creates it. But this one is more of a Cassatt being a Cassatt. Yes, it has the Japanese look to, and by the way, the coiffure on the back one means the hairstyle that she's doing. But this is really Mary Cassatt. This is a woman getting dressed. You can see the brush strokes very clearly. You can see the harsh blocks of color, that it's not really blended. You can see the little dots of color like on the wall, and the woman has her back to you, and it's just very candid scene, and the composition is a little bit awkward. Like, the mirror doesn't quite match up with what's on the scene, but very much Mary Cassatt is an impressionist here. Now, I just didn't want to show you one artist. This is Gustav Klimt. And Caillebout did a work of art called Paris Street Rainy Day, or Rainy Day Paris. He exhibited with the Impressionists, but there's a lot of people who say he shouldn't be an Impressionist because the things that he did in his pictures are much more clear and they're much more blended together. But at the same time, he's painting modern Paris life, which is what the Impressionists did. And the composition does kind of tilt up, and he used rainy day because you've got the light reflecting off the cobblestones and onto the umbrellas. But there's people who argue that Caillebout doesn't really count as an Impressionist because the technique is not really Impressionist. He's more like a Japanese style realist is what people would say. I disagree. I think he's an Impressionist just judging by this one. It's really got that Japanese floor tilt of like, the floor tilts down, the lines go up, it almost looks like it's flat. It's a very candid moment. But either way, I think Caillebout should count, me personally. All right. So we are now done with Impressionism, and we will next be moving into Post-Impressionism.